A worn Marine and his loyal shepherd push through a Spokane blizzard when they find a tiny puppy half buried in the snow, battered and barely breathing. Memories of war claw at him, urging retreat, yet he lifts the trembling life to his chest and carries it home. Inside his quiet cabin, man and dog fight the night together, coaxing warmth back into one fading heartbeat. Soon, whispers reveal the drunk who abandoned the pup to die. But when a starving kitten appears at the tree line, one rescue becomes a calling. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if no life should be left behind. Winter pressed its silence over Spokane, a heavy white hush rolling beneath a moon blurred by drifting frost. John Harris walked through that frozen quiet, as if moving through the afterlife of his own memories. At 65, the retired Marine carried a body still broad across the shoulders, still powerful in the forearms, still marked by the hard knots of old battlefield scars. Yet his face told another story entirely. Deep lines carved through his weathered skin. His gray beard grew uneven, the way it does when a man forgets to care about appearances. His eyes held a kind of exhausted vigilance, a soft sorrow that lingered long after the war had ended. People in town greeted him kindly, but even kindness could not reach the places inside him that had never come home. Every night he walked with Rex because stillness was an enemy he could not fight. Rex walked beside him with the slow, deliberate stride of an aging warrior. The German shepherd was 11 years old, his once proud sable coat now faded along the spine. His muzzle carried streaks of white like a soldier's hair turned gray too soon. Scars wove across his flank, faint but permanent reminders of the assignments he once shared with John. Even in old age, Rex's posture remained alert, his ears poised forward, his brown eyes sharp. He sensed danger long before John did. He always had. Though he was slower now and occasionally stiff in the limbs, his loyalty had not lost a single step. They followed their habitual route, snow crunching rhythmically under their boots and paws. John's breath came out in steady clouds that vanished in front of him like ghosts fading back into the night. He had lived alone in a wooden cabin at the far edge of Spokane for nearly a decade, far from the buzzing center of the city, choosing solitude over the forced warmth of crowded rooms. The cabin was quiet, safe, but it was also a place where memories echoed without mercy. When John closed his eyes at night, the thumping of helicopter blades replaced the wind. The smell of burning diesel replaced the smell of pine. The voice of a young private calling for help replaced the silence. This nightly walk was his only defense against the darkness in his own mind. Tonight felt heavier than usual. Something in the air carried tension, an invisible thread pulling at Rex before John even noticed. The dog stopped near a row of old abandoned cottages, their roofs sagging under the weight of winter. The wind whistled between broken fences, rattling pieces of loose tin. Rex's back stiffened. His ears snapped forward. A low rumble formed in his chest, quiet yet unmistakable. John halted. His heart kicked once, sharply, in the same way it did when he sensed an ambush overseas. Even after all these years, instinct moved faster than logic. His breath tightened. His hand reflexively hovered near the flashlight strapped to his belt. He scanned the shadows, the snow-covered ground, the trees that bowed like old men under the cold. Then a sound rose from beneath the wind. It was faint, thin, almost swallowed by the storm. A whimper, not human, not groan, something small, something freezing, something dying. John clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness in a trembling line, until it landed on a tiny shape curled beneath a collapsed porch step. The creature was barely more than a shadow at first, but as John stepped closer, the shape sharpened into the form of a very young puppy. Its fur was matted with ice. Its ribs were visible through a coat far too thin for winter. Its small body shook violently, not from fear alone, but from the cold burrowing into its bones. One eye was half closed, the other glazed, as though sleep and death were tugging in opposite directions. John felt something shift inside him, a small but powerful crack in the armor he had worn for too long. Rex moved instinctively to the front, planting his body between the puppy and the wind, as though shielding it with the last strength of his old warrior frame. John knelt beside the trembling bundle. His knees ached as they touched the frozen ground, but he didn't notice the pain. He reached out a thick, calloused hand, hesitating for only a heartbeat. Touching fragile life always triggered something in him, something deeper than memory. It dragged him back to the desert, to the feel of a young soldier's chest beneath his palm, rising and falling in a pattern he prayed would continue. He remembered holding on to a dying boy's dog tag until his knuckles turned white. He remembered promising himself he would never again let something helpless slip through his fingers. He slid his hands under the puppy. Warmth was nearly absent. The little creature was lighter than it should have been. Too light. Something like anger flickered across John's face. Not at the puppy, but at whoever had left it to freeze alone in the dark. The puppy's head rested against his wrist. Its breath was shallow, weak, but still present. Still fighting. Rex stepped closer, pressing his muzzle against the puppy's head, sniffing gently, exhaling warm air over its tiny ears. The old shepherd's eyes softened. Even he, worn and hardened, recognized vulnerability when it lay shaking before him. "It's all right," John murmured, his voice low and rough. "Easy now. I've got you." He lifted the puppy to his chest, tucking it beneath his coat. His arms closed around the small body with a protective instinct he didn't know he still possessed. The puppy gave a faint twitch, then a tiny sigh, as though letting itself trust for the first time in its short life. John pushed himself to his feet, the weight of the snow pressing against his boots. His breath was louder now, fog swirling with each exhale. The memory of war crept through him again, but not in the way that tormented him. This time it reminded him of purpose, of responsibility, of why he used to run into fire instead of away from it. He looked down at Rex, who was already waiting, poised, ready to follow him anywhere he went, as he always had. The dog glanced up at him with an expression that almost resembled approval. "Come on, partner," John whispered. "We're not leaving this one behind." With the puppy held close and Rex walking faithfully at his side, John turned back toward the path that led home. Snow fell harder now, but the storm felt strangely distant. Something warm pressed weakly against his heartbeat. Something alive. Something depending on him in a way that felt painfully familiar. For the first time in years, his steps felt sure. The night was still cold, still silent, but no longer empty. Tonight, he was carrying more than just memories. He was carrying a life. And it was the first thing in a long time that made him feel alive, too. Snow whispered against the wooden walls of the cabin as John Harris pushed the door shut behind him, sealing out the storm that chased him across the tree line. He crossed the dim room with slow, deliberate steps, holding the tiny, half-frozen puppy beneath his coat. The cabin smelled faintly of pine, old books, and the smoke of last night's fire, a smell that reminded John of the tents he once slept in overseas, where warmth came either from burning diesel barrels or from the bodies of fellow Marines huddled close to survive desert nights. Tonight, warmth came from something far smaller and more fragile. John laid the trembling puppy on a thick wool blanket spread beside the stone hearth. The blanket had once belonged to his father, a Navy veteran who believed every man needed exactly one good coat, one good pair of boots, and one good wool blanket. John had kept it after the funeral, though he had rarely used it. Now it seemed as though it had always been waiting for this moment. Rex moved instantly to the puppy's side. The old German shepherd lowered himself to the floor with a grunt of stiffness, positioning his body like a shield against the cold seeping from the cabin's wooden boards. His breath fogged softly, and he nudged the puppy's ear with his muzzle. Rex's instincts, sharpened by years of search and rescue assignments, had not dulled with age. If anything, the dog's sense of responsibility had grown deeper now that he was slowing down physically. Protecting the smallest creature in the room had become his new mission, one he accepted without hesitation. John crouched by the fire pit and arranged fresh logs in the grate. His hands were large, veined, and weather-beaten, fingers bent slightly from old fractures. When he struck the match, the flame illuminated the deep grooves across his knuckles, small scars from shrapnel and rope burns. He held the flame to the kindling until it caught, then fed the fire gently until it grew strong enough to paint the room in gold. Heat trickled outward, brushing the puppy's body. Its tiny legs twitched. A soft cry rose from its chest, thin but alive. John hovered his hands over the blaze until they were warm and then placed his palms lightly on the puppy's ribs. He could feel the engine of life sputtering under its skin, a fragile rhythm that forced his breath to pause. The puppy shivered violently. For one moment, John was no longer in his cabin. He was 23 again, kneeling over a young private named Lewis on a stretch of desert sand darkened with oil smoke. He remembered the way Lewis's chest had risen shallowly beneath his hands, how every breath had felt borrowed. He remembered whispering, "Stay with me, kid. Stay with me," even though he knew the boy could not hear him. John blinked hard and forced himself back into the present. The puppy was here. This time he still had a chance. He poured a small pot of milk and warmed it near the fire, swirling gently so it wouldn't scorch. The spoon clinked softly against the pot, a quiet sound in the otherwise silent room. When the milk was warm enough, he lifted the puppy, supporting its head with his fingertips. Its fur was damp and coarse, black mixed with patches of tan, and its bones felt far too prominent beneath its thin coat. He touched the spoon to its lips. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a slow and uncertain motion, the puppy flicked its tongue forward and accepted a drop of milk. John exhaled in relief. Outside, the wind howled like a distant engine. Inside, the fire crackled. The room grew warmer, but John still felt the cold lingering in his bones, a cold made not of winter, but of loneliness that had dwelled in him for years. Nights were long when one lived far from town, but they were far longer when one carried ghosts. Hours passed. Every few minutes, John placed a hand near the puppy's ribcage to make sure it still rose and fell. His coffee sat untouched on the table beside him, long since gone cold. Rex dozed lightly, but never allowed his head to rest completely. Each time the puppy whimpered, the old shepherd's ears twitched. It was nearly dawn when the tremors in the puppy's body lessened. Its breathing steadied into a weak but consistent rhythm. John gently stroked its head and murmured, "Good job, boy." He paused. He had not thought of a name yet, but the words slipped out naturally, as though it had formed somewhere deep inside him before the puppy had ever appeared in the snow. When the sun began to brighten the horizon outside the window, John finally allowed himself to stand. His back protested immediately, a stiff jolt pulsing down his spine, and he grunted softly. Getting older was a battle he accepted, but never felt prepared for. He walked to the counter and reached for the phone, the old landline with a coiled cord, because he preferred things that didn't depend on wireless signals or batteries. He dialed a number he had memorized years ago. The call rang twice before a woman's tired but steady voice answered. Marion Walker, the town's most respected veterinarian, and one of the few people who understood John without needing him to speak, listened silently as he described the puppy's condition. Marion was in her early 50s, tall and slender with warm copper-brown hair usually kept in a messy bun. Her eyes were a soft hazel with a patient, almost maternal depth, shaped by years of tending to broken animals and occasionally broken people. She had once been married to a firefighter who died in a structural collapse, and since then she lived alone, devoting her life to her clinic. Loss had made her gentler, not harder. When John finished speaking, Marion replied with quiet firmness. Bring it to the clinic, John, and bring Rex too. I know how you two operate. You never leave each other behind. Her voice struck a chord in him. He had heard similar words once during a night raid overseas, shouted through static and panic. It was strange how comfort could come, wrapped in echoes of old pain. John hung up and turned toward Rex, who was already watching him with alert anticipation. The puppy lay curled beneath the blanket, its breathing shallow but determined. The fire cracked, sending a warm glow across the puppy's fragile silhouette. For a moment John stood there, absorbing the sight. He had not felt purpose in a long while, not true purpose. Tonight he had stayed awake not because of nightmares, but because a life depended on him. That realization settled deep inside him, steady and grounding. He knelt beside the puppy once more, gently lifting it into his arms. Rex pressed close, ready to escort them. For the first time in many years, John Harris felt like a Marine again, not because of the uniform he no longer wore, but because he had someone to protect. He looked at the two animals beside him, one old and loyal, one young and fighting for survival, and whispered, "Let's go. We've got work to do." The cabin door opened to the pale morning light, and as the three stepped outside into the snow, John felt something shift in the air, something almost hopeful, as if the world had quietly acknowledged that the mission had begun. The morning light in Spokane arrived reluctantly, filtered through pale clouds that carried the last of the night's snow. John Harris pushed open the glass door of Marion Walker's veterinary clinic, its metal bell jingling softly above his head. The warm air inside washed over him, replacing the cold sting that had clawed through his coat during the drive. The clinic smelled of disinfectant, warm fur, fresh coffee, and something else. Hope, in the gentle way small places of healing often do. Marion, still in her light gray coat and dark scrub top, motioned him inside. Her hair was tied loosely today, strands of copper brown escaping the knot and softening her angular, mature features. She carried an air of calm authority, the way someone does when they have spent decades mending creatures who cannot speak for themselves. Her hazel eyes flickered with both concern and reassurance as she guided John toward the examination room. On the metal table lay the puppy, now wrapped in a thick fleece blanket. A small IV line fed warm fluids into his tiny vein. The rise and fall of his chest had grown steadier, though his body remained frighteningly fragile. Marion pressed a stethoscope gently against his ribs, listening with a frown of deep concentration. She was a woman who rarely showed fear, but her jaw tightened slightly as she assessed him. "His temperature is still low," she murmured. "Body mass is poor. He's been starved for quite some time, and his hind legs are weak, either from cold, malnutrition, or both." She lifted her head and looked directly at John. "But his heart is still working hard. He's fighting." The relief on John's face was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders relaxed a fraction, though the tension in his eyes remained. "He deserves a chance," he said quietly. Marion nodded and removed the blanket enough to reveal a faint indentation around the puppy's neck. "This wasn't just neglect," she said. "Someone tied him up for a long time. That's an old rope mark." She exhaled slowly, anger simmering beneath her calm. "John, this didn't happen by accident." Her gentle voice carried a steel edge. Marion was kind, but she was not passive. She volunteered with the local animal protection organization, often fighting the slow-moving gears of bureaucracy to help creatures too small to defend themselves. She had seen cases like this before, too many, but something about this puppy's condition struck her differently. Perhaps it was the way Rex sat near the table watching the puppy with a soldier's loyalty. Perhaps it was the silent pain etched across John's face. "Do you want to report this?" Marion asked. John didn't answer immediately. His jaw flexed, the muscles tightening beneath his beard. He thought of the war, of all the injustices he had witnessed without the power to stop them. He thought of the people he couldn't save, and he thought of the small creature now lying before him, shivering inside a blanket instead of a battlefield. "Yes," he said finally. "Someone needs to answer for what they did." Marion's shoulders eased. "I'll call animal control and the police. There are security cameras near the abandoned properties. We might get something." Rex barked once, softly, as though supporting the decision. For the next several days, Buddy, Marion had begun using the name after hearing John whisper it, remained under close care at the clinic. John visited every morning and every evening. He would walk in, nod to Marion or her assistant, a young veterinary technician named Daniel Moore, a slim man in his early 20s with sandy hair and an earnest personality, then sit beside the recovery pen. Daniel was polite and diligent, his soft-spoken nature shaped by growing up with a chronically ill sister whom he helped care for. He admired John deeply, though he rarely said so. Rex accompanied John each visit, lying patiently on the floor, ears perked, watching Buddy through the bars. More than once, Buddy seemed to calm when Rex rested his muzzle near him. The sight softened the hardened lines of John's face. On the fourth day, a police officer arrived at the clinic. He introduced himself as Officer Mark Ellery, a man in his late 30s with close-cropped brown hair and a square jaw that suggested both discipline and weariness. His uniform fit neatly, though the dark circles under his eyes hinted at too many double shifts. He shook John's hand firmly, glancing at him with a professional respect often reserved for veterans. "Mr. Harris, we've reviewed footage from the cameras behind the old row of cottages," Ellery said. "We identified a man who frequently leaves the property late at night. His name is Thomas Boyd. Neighbors have filed previous complaints: verbal abuse, loud disturbances, and reports of mistreating animals." John's expression darkened. "What happens to him now?" "We've cited him on several counts," Ellery said. "He's been fined heavily. The courts are adding an official animal cruelty charge to his record, and he's now legally prohibited from owning animals for years to come." He paused. This was more than carelessness, Mr. Harris. It was deliberate. But we've made sure Buddy won't go back to him. John didn't say anything for a long moment. Not because he disagreed, but because justice felt like a strange luxury to him. So many times, fairness had been impossible on the battlefield. Now, seeing it applied, even just a little, felt like a wound stitching itself closed. "Thank you," John said simply. Ellery nodded and left as quietly as he had arrived. That evening, when Buddy was finally allowed a few minutes outside his enclosure, John stood near him with Rex at his side. Buddy's legs were weak, trembling beneath him, but he lifted his head when Rex approached. A tiny sound slipped from his throat, half a whine, half a greeting. Rex responded with a soft, approving chuff. John watched them, his chest tightening in a way he hadn't expected. "We didn't just save him from the cold," he said softly to Rex. "We saved him from going back to a place that hurt him." Rex wagged his tail slowly, his eyes warm and trusting. Something shifted inside John then. It wasn't dramatic, not a sharp moment of revelation, but a subtle easing, like the slow thaw of ice on a river. Some invisible wound inside him, one carved by years of war and loneliness, softened at the edges. For the first time in many winters, the night felt a little less heavy. Winter loosened its grip on Spokane only slightly in the weeks that followed, but inside John Harris's wooden cabin, the cold no longer dictated the rhythm of each day. The small living room that once held only silence and the occasional creak of settling logs had become a humble recovery station. Blankets were folded into soft piles, a portable heat lamp glowed near the floor, and a set of towels hung neatly over a chair, ready for physical therapy sessions. For the first time in years, purpose, not memory, filled the air. Buddy lay on his side near the hearth, his belly rising and falling with the unsteady effort of healing. His coat, once stiff with ice and thin from starvation, had begun to regain a faint sheen. The patches of tan and black fur still looked uneven, but warmth had returned to his skin. He watched John with brightening, hopeful eyes, though his small frame tensed each time he tried to move his hind legs. John knelt beside him with the same deliberate patience he had once used cleaning his rifle after long patrols. His hands were steady, warm, and strong despite the sharp ache in his joints. Marion had given him printed instructions, and he followed them faithfully. The sheet included sketches of canine muscle groups, notes on circulation stimulation, and a careful list of recommended exercises. Every morning and evening, John massaged Buddy's hind legs with slow circular movements, pressing just enough to encourage circulation without causing pain. Rex supervised these sessions with solemn dedication. The old German shepherd sat at John's side like a senior officer monitoring a trainee. His ears flicked whenever Buddy whimpered, and his tail thumped approvingly each time Buddy completed a movement correctly. When Buddy slacked or grew distracted, Rex nudged him gently, a gruff encouragement that seemed half annoyance, half affection. One morning, as John slid a rolled towel under Buddy's hips to lift him slightly from the floor, Rex barked once in protest at Buddy's reluctance to engage his muscles. John chuckled quietly. "Easy, Sergeant. He's still learning." He lifted Buddy's hindquarters in a soft sling, supporting most of the weight with his own hands. Buddy pressed his front paws firmly into the floor, trembling with effort, but his rear legs wobbled uncontrollably. "Good," John murmured. "Just like that. One more breath." Marion's voice echoed in his mind. "Give him encouragement, but don't pity him. He needs to rebuild strength, not fear effort." John nodded inwardly. If there was one thing he understood, It was rebuilding from brokenness. Buddy's tiny body was not so different from a wounded private, or perhaps even from John himself, still holding on despite scars deeper than flesh. Day after day, progress arrived in small victories. A longer step, a stronger push, less hesitation. Buddy moved from trembling resistance to determined participation, even letting out frustrated yips when exercises ended too soon. At night, things were harder. Some nights, the nightmares came back with more force than before. Helicopter blades pounding in his ears, heat waves shimmering above sand, the shouts of men he never saw again. He often woke with his breath trapped in his chest and a tremor in his hands. But now, instead of empty darkness, he would find Rex lying across his feet, and Buddy curled into the hollow of his ribs, the puppy's warm breath pressing against his heart. 2 steady lives grounding a soul that had wandered too long. "This is new," he whispered during one sleepless dawn, staring at the ceiling as snowlight entered the cracks of the window shutters. Not better or worse, just new. A different kind of battle, a quieter one. One afternoon, after the snowfall had paused and the wind ran softer through the treetops, John decided Buddy was ready to try walking outside for the first time. He wrapped the familiar towel sling under Buddy's hips and stepped out onto the small patch of flattened snow behind the cabin. Rex trotted ahead, ears forward, tail stiff with anticipation. The air was crisp, the type of cold that sharpened the lungs rather than crushed them. Buddy sniffed the ground first, uncertain. Then he leaned into the towel, front legs braced, back legs trembling violently. John supported most of the weight, adjusting gently to help Buddy find his balance. "Whenever you're ready," John whispered. Buddy exhaled a tiny huff, gathered what strength he had, and pushed into the earth. His hindquarters shifted, dipped, then steadied for a brief, miraculous moment. His legs held. Not long, mere seconds, but long enough for John's breath to catch sharply in his throat. Buddy tried again. This time he lasted longer. 10 seconds. Maybe 12. John felt something rise inside him, warm and painful in all the right ways. His eyes stung, and he blinked hard. "That's it, Buddy. That's it. You're stronger than you think." Rex barked triumphantly and circled him, tail sweeping the snow into soft arcs. Buddy fell gently to his haunches, exhausted but proud, eyes shining with an unmistakable spark. The 3 stood there for a moment, an injured pup, an aging shepherd, and an old Marine, held together not by shared blood or command, but by survival, loyalty, and the stubborn courage to keep trying. That evening, as they returned to the cabin, John placed Buddy down just inside the doorway and stepped back to slip off his boots. A faint pattern in the snow near the steps caught his attention. Small footprints. Not canine. He leaned closer. The prints were delicate, rounded, and widely spaced, the hallmark of a cat. A small one. He straightened, eyebrows raised, a reluctant smile tugging the corners of his mouth. "Looks like we've got a visitor," he murmured. Rex sniffed the prints with great seriousness, then sneezed in apparent disapproval. Buddy tilted his head curiously, tail thumping. John rubbed his beard and glanced toward the dark line of trees. "Maybe this little forest still has more lost souls than I realized." As the cabin door closed behind them, John felt something shift once more. Gentle, almost imperceptible, like the first sign that winter might one day give way to spring. And for a man who had lived too long with frost inside his chest, even the smallest thaw felt like hope. Snow had settled into a gentle rhythm around the cabin by the time several more weeks passed. What had once been a solitary home standing at the edge of the Spokane woods now felt strangely alive, as if the land itself sensed the quiet shift taking place inside its walls. Each morning, faint paw prints appeared in the fresh powder, small, rounded, light enough that the wind nearly erased them by noon. They circled the cabin, wandered near the woodpile, and sometimes trailed toward the old truck before drifting off into the forest again. Rex had become the unofficial perimeter guard of these mysterious visits. The aging German shepherd would lower his nose to the tiny imprints with the seriousness of a detective studying a crime scene. He huffed thoughtfully each time he caught the faint scent of cat, his ears twitching with mild annoyance at the idea of an uninvited creature trespassing so boldly. Buddy, in contrast, responded with excitement. The young pup, still regaining strength, would scramble to the nearest window whenever a shadow flickered across the yard, letting out small, high-pitched barks that carried eagerness rather than warning. John Harris began leaving a small bowl of food near the corner of the yard, not out of pity, but out of a feeling he could not quite describe. It was a mixture of curiosity, responsibility, and something gentler, something that softened the stiffness in his chest. Sometimes he stood at the window after placing the food down, holding a mug of cooling coffee, watching the forest as if waiting for an answer. "You're feeding ghosts," he muttered to himself. But the truth was simpler. He liked the idea that someone else out there, no matter how small, was depending on him. It had been a long time since he'd been needed. One night, a storm swept through the mountains. Wind rattled the cabin's shutters, and snow lashed the porch in sharp waves. John zipped his coat and opened the door to let Rex and Buddy outside before the worst of it arrived. Buddy, stronger each week, no longer needed the towel sling for short distances, though his steps remained cautious and uneven. Rex trotted calmly beside him, always keeping his pace slow enough to match Buddy's. Buddy suddenly froze, sniffed the air, and broke into an unsteady run toward the large pine near the truck. His bark, quick, urgent, unfamiliar, echoed into the night. Rex reacted instantly, bounding after him with protective intensity. John followed at a brisk pace, boots crunching deep into the snow. At the base of the pine tree, nestled into a hollow formed by twisting roots and sheltered just enough from the storm, was a tiny cat. No more than a few months old, with dark gray fur matted from the snow and patches of brown streaking across its sides. Its eyes were a pale blue-gray, wide with exhaustion rather than fear. The kitten trembled violently, its breath forming fragile wisps in the cold air. John knelt beside it slowly. The kitten tried to lift its head, but it sagged back down, too weak to resist when he reached forward. His thick hands, scarred from years of gripping rifles and dragging wounded men to safety, became impossibly gentle as he scooped the trembling creature into his coat. The kitten let out a tiny sound, barely more than a whisper, before pressing itself against the warmth of his chest. Buddy stepped closer and sniffed cautiously, then licked the kitten's head with the sincerity of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be cold and alone. Rex stood behind them, steady and calm, giving the faintest wag of his tail. There was no jealousy, only acceptance, as if he too understood that their small pack had just added another lost soul. John held the kitten against his heart the whole walk back to the cabin, shielding it from the storm. He remembered doing the same for Buddy weeks earlier, and the memory filled him with a soft ache he couldn't quite name. The next morning, he loaded both dogs and the kitten into his truck and drove to Marion Walker's clinic. The bell above the door jingled, and Marion glanced up from her desk. Her warm hazel eyes widened in disbelief before a bright laugh escaped her. "Well, look at this," she said, brushing a loose strand of copper-brown hair behind her ear. "A Marine, 2 dogs, and now a kitten? John, your cabin is turning into a rescue outpost." John did not deny it. Instead, he settled into the chair beside the examination table as Marion took gentle stock of the kitten's condition. The small creature was underweight, dehydrated, and exhausted, but its injuries were minor. Marion worked with careful hands, her voice soft and reassuring as she cleaned the kitten's fur and administered warm fluids. Rex sat nearby like an oversized chaperone. Buddy watched from John's feet, tail swaying. When the appointment ended, Marion wrapped the kitten in a soft towel and placed it carefully into John's arms. Her expression changed slightly, still lighthearted, but carrying something thoughtful beneath the surface. "You know," she said, "if you keep this up, we're going to run out of space in this clinic." John stroked the kitten's back, steady and slow. "Marion," he began quietly, "I've been thinking about something." She folded her arms gently and waited, her face open, curious. "I've got land, a cabin, more room than I need, and I've got a retirement check that covers my bills. You've got the medical expertise, the heart. The community knows you." He glanced down at the towel-wrapped kitten, then at Buddy, then at Rex. "What if we didn't just rescue them by accident? What if we made it official?" Marion blinked. A small, hopeful smile tugged at her lips, but she didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice carried a tremor he hadn't expected. "John, I've always wanted to start a rescue. Always. I just never had the land or the support to do it right." "Well," he said softly, "now you do." Her eyes shone. "Are you sure?" John nodded once. The decision felt like stepping into a new mission, one free of violence yet full of purpose. A year later, a wooden sign hung proudly beside the cabin door. The letters were hand-carved and uneven, but they carried the weight of something deeply true. Harris and Walker Animal Rescue, no soul left behind. John still dreamed of war at times, still woke with sweat on his brow. But when morning arrived, instead of silence and old ghosts, he found Rex's steady presence, Buddy's eager bark, and the kitten, now grown, curled on his chest, purring like a small heartbeat of gratitude. And in those moments, John understood something he had forgotten long ago. A soldier may leave the battlefield, but courage never retires. It simply shifts to protect the frail, the forgotten, the small lives that depend on kindness instead of strength. Sometimes, the miracles we ask God for do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly, on 4 tired paws, or wrapped in the trembling heartbeat of a creature that simply needed someone to stop, to kneel, and to care. John Harris believed he had already lived the hardest chapters of his life. Yet God still placed new purpose in his hands. Purpose small enough to fit inside a blanket, but powerful enough to heal the wounds war had left behind. In every town, in every home, there are souls, human and animal alike, waiting for a moment of kindness, waiting for someone to choose compassion over convenience. And maybe that is the true miracle, that God entrusts ordinary people with gentle opportunities to save one another. As you go back to your own day, may you look for the quiet blessings around you, a neighbor who needs a smile, a friend who needs a call, a stray creature who needs a warm porch. These are the moments in which God whispers his love into the world. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or share your own story of a small miracle in your life. And if you'd like more heartfelt stories of courage, faith, and second chances, remember to subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you gently today and every day.